Welcome to Elephants in the Boardroom, the podcast about the grey elephants, those maybe overlooked, but definitely already here, massive trends, forces that are changing the world, but also providing incredible opportunities for business leaders who are ready for them. My name is Graeme Codrington, and as always, I'm joined by my partner,
Dean van Leeuwen. And Elephants in the Boardroom is brought to you by our friends at Achilles. Achilles is a sustainable supply chain risk management company. Achilles supports the world's biggest companies to create and maintain ethical, sustainable, and transparent supply chains. While we navigate our way through the elephants in the boardroom, Achilles are leading the way, helping businesses to navigate the risks and opportunities associated with many of these grey elephants. If you're a person who is interested in the impact of change on your supply chain or ESG strategy, it's worth speaking to Achilles. So head over to achilles.com.
So, Dean, we're a quarter of the way through the quarter of the century year. We're into the second quarter of 2025, and the world continues to move at speed. I mean, it always has, it always does. But my word, 2025 feels like a thing, doesn't it? And how are you experiencing it there in the UK? It looks like your Labour government and their, what do they call it when they do this mini budget of theirs, their summer update?
The spring budget.
Yeah, the spring budget, yeah. Sounds as if people are not exactly sure what they should be doing next.
Well, you know, Graeme, when through our research, I remember sort of as we were approaching the 2020s, we started to get a sense that the 2020s would be a decade of disruption. I think from about 2017 onwards, we've been saying to leaders, start being prepared. This is going to be a disruptive decade. But the exciting thing is that there are huge opportunities to create the future. And so don't look at this as a risk, as a challenge. Look at it through the lens of an opportunity. And boy, our research has been spot on, from predicting Donald Trump's election back as far back as 2015, to even seeing the signs for the war in Ukraine and Russia's saber clashing, and it's we've been identifying that this is a decade of disruption, and boy, it's living up to that.
Absolutely. Well, let's get into the news. Both you and I have brought a topic of conversation. Let me kick off with mine. A number of years ago, it probably is 10 years ago now, if I go back and have a look at it, I was one of the people who jumped into the new science of being able to get your genetic code sequenced. And there was a company called 23andMe that took the early lead. And I remember sending off my money to them and then receiving a little spit test kit in the post and dutifully filling it up with phlegm and sending it back. And then a few weeks later, getting this incredibly complicated and in-depth genetic analysis. And then I paid for the extra thing on top of it called the Prometheus pack, which sort of turned it into a little bit of English and gave you things like what food should you be eating and what food should you be avoiding and how much sleep should you get. And it genuinely was amazing in terms of some of the insights. I did, in fact, make some changes and all of them were very positive. And when I had some medical issues through COVID a few years ago, was able to give a little bit of information, not obviously as a medical expert or a genetics expert, but kind of gave my doctor a little bit of information that allowed him to make some changes to some of what he was suggesting in terms of medications. So it's all been very good. Some interesting things I discovered, Dean, most people are amazed at where their family history has taken them, and they've got genes from this part of the world and that part of the world. Good grief, somebody in our past was Chinese. Can you even imagine? Well, I had none of that. I ended up being as far back as genetics could go. I am apparently British. I don't know what that means, if that's Anglo-Saxon, because I'm sure I'm not from the Celtic side of things. But I think Anglo-Saxon, as far back as the genetic goes, 96% Anglo-Saxon, and the other 4% was Neanderthal. which was maybe a little bit more Neanderthal than I was expecting.
I was going to say, you're a British Rose.
Can you believe it? Can you believe now this anti-racist, anti-colonial campaigner, and my genetics has put me back into a really bad historical category. But anyway, all of that aside, here's what happened last week. 23andMe announced bankruptcy, and it was very interesting. Dean, I know you know our colleague Peter Geldenes, who's part of an associate of our team and probably our most sort of advanced technology guru. And when I told him 10 years ago that I was going to do this 23andMe thing, he said, please, Graeme, whatever you do, don't use your real name. So when you fill in the forms and everything, use a pseudonym. And he explained to me, and he said, here's what could happen in the future. Right now, you don't think about it. It's, you're just having fun with this genetics test. But what happens if in the future, if the government takes over the 23andMe database, or if your medical company or an insurance company, for example, subpoenas your data and it's supplied to them in court, and then you cannot say to them, I didn't know about this genetic precondition or whatever. So if any insurance product has got, what do they call it, those pre-existing conditions clauses and things, which many of them have, you don't want this to be linked back to you. So I listened to Peter because he's that smart, and I put in a pseudonym. So my data is sitting there under a fake name, so they can't trace it back to me. But 23andMe have gone bankrupt. And right now, we don't know who owns the data. Obviously, there's a bankruptcy process and somebody will take over the company. But if the company just disappears, are they going to scrub that data? They haven't told us yet. Now, I'm not blaming 23andMe, and obviously there's going to be a process in place. But there's a lot of very, very valuable data sitting in a bankrupt company at the moment. And my genetic data is part of that database. You can go online. In fact, we'll put a link in the show notes to the document that's been floating around saying, how do you delete your data from the 23andMe database? And I am in the process of doing that. Download it first so you've got it, but then delete it off of their database. So that probably feels like a good thing to do at the moment. But Dean, I just thought that this is an interesting conversation because it touches on quite a few of our gray elephants. It touches on obviously the technology side of things and thinking through data and data integrity and who owns the data and so on. It probably links into rising rage, because if I discovered that somebody bought that data and then started using it as a weapon against me, you can be sure that I would jump to rage quite quickly. But for me, I just thought it is a data point in a data-driven world that impacts on data that many people might have created. 23andMe is bankrupt, the end of an era.
I'm rather saddened by the fact that they've gone bankrupt.
Me too.
Like you at the time when 23andMe were promoting their product and you could do the mail order. And I actually bought my wife and my son a 23andMe kit for Christmas. So they unwrapped their present and dinner and, looking at me a bit strangely. What is he doing? So we did that as a family. So, the same boat as you. Our data now sits on their servers and who owns it? It's a really great question. And I think when you think about gray elephants, it's all about thinking about, what are the highly probable, high impact, but largely ignored sort of forces of change. And absolutely, this is ignored. We know that there's an issue around who owns our data in the metaverse, on the cloud. How do we delete our data? What do we do with it? This is a huge thing. We know it's going to have a big, big impact, but people are largely ignoring the reality of it. As technology advances, we're finding that we have the ability to capture massive amounts of information. We can now process it in real time. It took scientists, genetic scientists, think over 10 years to map out the DNA, and billions of dollars with 23andMe. I think they could do it overnight. And we can use that information to immediate and valuable effect. So it's incredibly, alluring. The ability to use this information and to provide this data and have it processed for you immediately is very compelling. But as you said, the gray elephant, the elephant in the boardroom is, right, so who owns this? And if you're a business leader or you're a consumer, you kind of need to know what the legal rights are around this. And it's a real gray area, excuse the pun.
So action points for anyone listening, as an individual, for yourself, do a quick data audit if you like. Everything from your retail loyalty cards to your cloud to where your photos are stored. Take some time. Yes, there's a little bit of work involved here, but that's the whole point of a gray elephant sitting in the corner of the room, right? Ignore it if you want to, but when it starts to stampede, it's going to hurt you if you haven't thought about it. As a business leader, you have responsibility for the data you hold. And of course, you know that. And you might be subject to one or other of the data protection laws that are in place around the world. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be thinking about this. For most businesses, data should be a bigger and better asset than it currently is, but it is an asset already. And you need to make sure that you're looking after it, that you've got contingencies in place. And if your data is somehow linked to another company, you're hosting it on a server, cloud server somewhere, or somebody else actually gathered it for you and hosts it for you, well, just make sure that you do some due diligence on that other company and know what will happen if that company goes bankrupt or there's a data breach. So, might sound obvious, but that's the whole point of the elephants in the boardroom. Sometimes it's the obvious things that we haven't actually looked at, either from a risk perspective or, in fact, the opportunity perspective. I suppose there's a third action point. If you've got a bit of money and would like everybody in the world's genetic data, buy 23andMe. I'm guessing there would be some interest in people taking it over, but maybe even by the time you listen to this, it's all been resolved in a great way. But Dean, what have you been seeing?
So, Graeme, as you know, with grey elephants, we're often looking for the weak signal that's coming over the horizon, something that suggests that a grey elephant might start stampeding. So we're looking for something that's visible, but that business leaders might be ignoring. And I think I've come up with an absolute cracker for this session. And so what I want to talk to you about is a grey elephant that flows quietly through every value and supply chain. Yet, from our research, it's showing that it's barely registering in the boardrooms. And this grey elephant is water. And we categorize water within the big squeezes of the grey elephants. And we're saying it's it's part of the big squeezes because only 12% of the world's population lives in water-secure countries. The countries facing water security issues account for 72% of the world population, and an additional 8% of the global population is facing critical water insecurity. And start running out of water, and boy, you will see disruption happening on a massive scale. And water isn't just a resource, it's infrastructure, it's energy, it's agriculture, it's manufacturing. It's essential to business continuity in every sector, and it's increasingly under pressure. This isn't a future risk. It's a current compounding crisis, squarely in the big squeezes category. So before I dive in, and I want to ask you, Graeme, for the last 2 episodes, you've put me on the spot with a quiz. So I've got a question for you this time. Let's see if I can get my own back.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay, so here's my question to you, Graeme. The Himalayas, right, is a vast mountain range, okay? It extends over 5 different countries: India, China, Nepal, Pakistan, and Bhutan, right? Its glaciers feed 10 major river systems, all right? Can you tell me roughly what percentage of the world's population relies on the glacier-fed water system that originates in the Himalayas? I'll give you a little clue here. is it?
Wow.
15%, 25%, 40%, or 60% of the world population?
Good grief. So I did do geography back in my A levels, but I'm not sure the world map is as clear in my head as it should be here. So definitely we're feeding into India. Definitely we're feeding into China. I'm guessing there's probably some feed up into Russia. And then obviously there's a whole lot of smaller countries there as well. Probably across Pakistan, I might have guessed. Just trying to think which way the rivers run. So it probably goes in that direction as well. So we definitely not, it's way more than 15%. It's probably upwards of more than half. So give me what were the upper options that I had? Was it 60%, somewhere around there?
25, 40, and 60% the world population.
Okay. So if you hadn't given me any options, I probably would have said it was close to half. So I'm going to go with 60% to the upper end. It might not be this much, but
split the difference. It's actually 40% of the world's population. It's a massive figure.
Yeah. But I mean, that's still huge, right?
It's huge. Absolutely. I mean, 3 billion people depend on 10 major rivers that start in the Himalayas.
In one mountain range.
Yeah. One mountain range, yeah. And they depend on it for their fresh water, for agriculture, sanitation, energy. So this brings, now let me talk to you about the harsh truth that we're seeing. The future of these glaciers in the Himalayas, the future is bleak. All right. Even if we limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we are on track to lose 1/3 of all the Himalaya glaciers in the next 2 decades. If global temperatures rise above 2%, 2/3 of the glaciers are doomed. All right. Now, this impact won't hit all at once. It'll come in waves. And first, as the ice melts and the glacier lakes overflow, it's going to trigger massive floods and landslides. We're then going to see a steep decline in the river flows. This will reduce food production, strain hydropower output, accelerate water scarcity. It's going to lead to increased risks in social unrest and migration. And this is not a regional story. It's a global economic risk. As I said, the Himalayas span these big countries. It's 30% of the global GDP that's reliant on this region. And as we've shown 40% of the global population. What happens here is going to ripple through global supply chains, food systems, energy markets, political stability. And the crisis doesn't end just there. We also need to talk about something that's called day zero. Now, day zero refers to the point at which a city runs out of water. Literally tap stop running. And municipalities are forced to enforce rations just to maintain basic hygiene and subsistence. And this isn't theoretical. Graeme, as you know, in South Africa, in 2018, Cape Town came perilously close to running out of water. Historic multi-year drought pushed city to the brink. Reservoirs dropped to critical levels, and they were saved by rain at the end of the day. But it came within, I don't know, I think you might remember, but I think it was about 2 or 3 days.
I think it was about 14 days or so that they were counting down. So it was less than 2 weeks water supply for the whole city.
Just frightening. And it's not just, the Western Cape. Studies show that they lost over 6 billion dollars in economic output was lost. Just last year, Mexico City faced its own day zero threat. This is becoming a global norm, and it's becoming a new normal. The UN assessment warns that global fresh water demand will outstrip supply by 40% by 2030. Already there are 2 billion people who lack access to clean drinking water. So, we need to think about which cities are next. Bangalore, Beijing, Cairo, Moscow, Tokyo. This is a highly probable, high impact, but it's an ignored force of change. This is going to disrupt global economies and societies dramatically unless we find solutions, unless we work towards creating more water security. It impacts every single industry, from insurance to tech to agriculture, mining, manufacturing. I think this is a grey elephant that people should be losing sleep about.
I couldn't agree more. And having lived in a country where, Cape Town literally experienced this, we've got colleagues, Peter Geldness, who we were just talking about, lives down there. Obviously it's no joke, but it's more than, than just something, we can sort ourselves out. This is something that, like a global pandemic, affects rich and poor. You can't buy yourself out of this because nobody's got a private dam. Maybe the billionaires do, but the rest of us don't. The social and civil unrest that flows from that is way worse than anything else. When people run out of water, society collapses. It's as simple as that. It's a one step, two step done. And so this is not something that you can just put to the side and say, it'll never happen. It nearly has, and it probably will soon. So, there's not much good news there. And obviously you're going to have to stretch your imagination quite far to find the opportunity. But of course, the opportunities exist in any of these grey elephants.
The interesting thing, Graeme, think about opportunities, and maybe this is where funding really needs to focus, is that we have an enormous amount of water sitting in our oceans. We get some fresh, drinkable water, but we now have incredible technology. AI, quantum computing should be able to find the solutions for creating fresh water out of salt water. We have nanotechnology, nanomembranes. The technology is there. I think businesses need to be thinking about water resilience. They need to think about how they can use less water, how they can provide more water to the community. So we work with quite a few large mining organizations, and we've helping them to think through their water strategy. And it's not just about their own resilience, it's also about providing water to their communities. And then what are the business opportunities? A lot of companies are looking at the clean energy economy and batteries, technology, and so on, and there's a huge amount of money to be made there. But water, I think, is the next big economy that's just waiting to be untapped.
Come on, there must be a 16-year-old out there somewhere who needs an idea for their science project for their A-levels. Find a way to allow us to access the oceans and turn that water into water that's a lot more usable. I mean, honestly, if you were an alien looking in saying, what are you guys worried about water? And you've got a blue planet over there. But obviously it's the wrong kind of water. 97% of the water we have, we can't use for drinking. So there's your opportunity. That's probably as good a place as any to just take a quick break. And when we come back after the break, we're going to do something a bit different. On Elephants in the Boardroom podcast, we have a guest, and we're going to be interviewing Paul, the CEO of Achilles. But let's take a quick break.
Right, welcome back. As Graeme said, we have an exciting guest who we're going to be talking to. Dr. Paul Stanley is the CEO of Achilles. So we're thrilled to have Paul joining us. He has over 25 years of experience as executive chair, CEO, and non-executive director. He runs businesses. He has run businesses in more than 90 countries worldwide, with revenues from startups to more than $3 billion per annum. He has experience from fintech, software, technology, maritime technology, energy, ESG, sustainability. Paul brings with him a wealth of knowledge that's applicable to our broader understanding of grey elephants and how these grey elephants run. So, Paul, welcome to Elephants in the Boardroom. Really looking forward to speaking to you about the challenges that you see in your industry and the opportunities that grey elephants present. So, Paul, welcome to Elephants in the Boardroom. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Dean. Great to be with you both.
A few questions. Just going to have a chat. I was saying as if we were enjoying a good glass of wine. Just want to hear your thoughts about grey elephants and what you're seeing and the impact that you see that this having on your clients. But let's start and talk a little bit about Achilles' mission. So, you've been helping businesses manage their supply chain risks for over 30 years. If you had to sum up Achilles' mission in today's world, what would it be?
Yeah, Achilles' mission is to use data, software, and services to empower businesses to build resilient, sustainable, and compliant supply chains. That trusted data that we provide is at the heart of everything. So we believe in providing our customers with what we term epistemic validity in the data. We curate it, we validate it, we audit it, so that the organizations that we serve sleep easy at night, knowing that we've captured a fair representation of the risk and opportunity that they carry in their supply chain. And they can use that data and insight to deliver actionable results.
In a fast-changing world, in a complex world, that service is incredibly powerful and useful for your customers. So what do you see as the biggest challenges that are facing your clients right now?
Well, we operate across a very broad range of risks, from health and safety through ESG, carbon, environment, human rights, modern slavery, child labor, ILO regulations, financial stability, sanctions and watch lists, cybersecurity, adverse media. So really anything that could trip you up in the supply chain is on our radar. And of course, the complexity that our customers face at the moment comes from the evolving standards that are required of them in terms of emerging regulation. In Europe, we might think of CSRD. In India, we might think of BRSR. But actually, almost everywhere you go in the world, the complexity of the regulatory environment is increasing. There's also just a simple issue of visibility and complexity in the supply chain. Supply chains get complex pretty quickly. It's fascinating to see how many thousands of suppliers can be involved in the manufacture of one single product. And those suppliers can come from all over the world. And as you get to level 2, level 3 in the supply chain, it can become quite opaque. And therefore, actually, you're never really sure who you're dealing with unless you do the analysis. So allowing people that greater visibility through that complexity is one of the challenges. There's a lot of focus on ESG and sustainability pressures. When we saw the change of government in the US, there was a moment when people felt that the ESG agenda might be diluted in some way. Actually, we're not seeing that. What we're seeing is large global companies saying, well, that's politics. What we're interested in is running good businesses, and good governance leads to better results, more reliable results, and so on. So despite the political swing, the angry people result, if you like, what we're seeing is large, responsible companies thinking globally, thinking long-term, and continuing to maintain their investment in these areas. Of course, there's lots of data around, but that data needs to be curated in a way that's digestible, the way that's usable. A lot of cost pressure on operational efficiency, huge amount of technological disruption at the moment. The rapid emergence of AI is really changing things. And it's a positive force in the supply chain. We're using it very effectively to provide predictive analytics rather than reactive. And of course, the world's been through a fair amount of disruption over recent times. We've seen geopolitical tension. We're still living out the consequences of COVID. We've seen new tariffs coming in over the last few weeks and threats of even more. And of course, that's a great complexity for organizations to navigate their way through. And so that means that people in procurement positions, people in strategic positions in businesses are trying to figure out where and how to buy the critical materials that they need to deliver their products and services. And so we're seeing changing patterns of trade as a result of that, and therefore even more complexity in building and maintaining a resilient supply chain.
Geez, Paul, so those are the issues you deal with on a Monday. What do you do with the rest of your week?
Hey, we've not even got to climate change.
I mean, it strikes me that actually, as I listen to you, logistics and supply chain is almost like the hidden glue behind everything else that happens in the rest of the world. That where some companies have the luxury of dealing with one country's regulations, or one region's IT issues. You've got to have this global view, and your scope goes, as you say, from climate change to regulations, from currency issues to HR issues, and so on. So I actually think it's quite a lovely analogy, or not analogy, what's the right word? A lovely picture that is very close to the picture that we have of these grey elephants, that there are these things that are there, always there, that people need to deal with, but many companies are just ignoring them. But from the sounds of it, you've got to deal with all of these issues. None of those issues you've just listed can be ignored. And that must be quite something to keep your eyes open for all of these things coming your way.
We're probably the most global of organizations in this sector. We have offices in 22 countries. We deliver service into more than 140 countries in 37 languages. So we stay close to not just the global regulations, but also the local regulations and how they might impact on contractors, subcontractors, and further down the value chain. And there's also a cultural dimension to what's acceptable in different jurisdictions around the world. And coming at this with a mindset from one particular culture or economy doesn't work. You have to understand also what works locally, and what represents fairness, ultimately. I think that global perspective is important. We have a team of regulatory experts who stay close to what's happening and are even involved in consulting with governments on what should happen and what the consequences might be. So that puts us in a fairly privileged position, I think, in terms of being able to deliver more predictive analytics to our clients. But yeah, that global perspective relates to some of the largest businesses in the world. They'd be our hiring clients. But also we work with not-for-profits, we work with nation-state governments and so on, who also need to procure enormous amounts of stuff from somewhere in the world.
Paul, I don't want to get just a little bit of free consultancy on the side for ourselves, but maybe I could sense check one or two of our insights through your lens, if you don't mind.
Sure.
We have this radar, this disruption radar, which is the title of the podcast. That there are these grey elephants out there, highly probable forces of change that businesses often ignore until they become a crisis. And one of the major forces that we are seeing in the world at the moment, we've called it rising rage. And it's really about the fact that there's all of these pressures of change. You've given us a nice long list, but economic and political pressures that then have impact on the lives of individuals as well as industries and governments all around the world, and then growing public discontent about that. It seems to us to be a flashpoint in every part of the world, not just the traditional sort of politically unstable parts of the world that I'm sure a few ships and airplanes have to fly through that you worry about, but almost anyway you look. There's the sense that just something could trigger a response, whether that response is riots on the streets or people striking or just general discontent in society. So that's what we see as one of the big 7 forces that companies need to be thinking about. Are you seeing anything along those lines and in the supply chain process, rising rage?
Yeah, we see that as a global phenomena as well. Partly it's been expressed at the ballot box with some of the political changes over the last year, where we've seen really quite unusual candidates coming from probably a non-political background, suddenly emerging to be national leaders and having positions of real power as people around the world are discontent with their living standards. They're dealing with inflation. They're dealing with interest rate hikes. They have a perception in some parts of the world that immigration's the issue. And so all of those political undertones are affecting attitudes. But the thing that I notice most is the extraordinary visibility into the actions of organizations that comes through social media, the internet, and so on, means that B2B issues quickly become consumer issues. Brands become challenged because of their actions. Even if they weren't directly responsible, it could be somebody in the supply chain that's responsible. Nobody cares it was your subcontractor. They want to blame the brand when something goes wrong. And so areas that we see as issues are first of all, exploitation of vulnerable workers in some of the most challenging industries in the world, in some of the most challenging jurisdictions. If you think about the transition to net zero, you can't do that without critical minerals. And those critical minerals are actually not in short supply, but they have to be obtained. And they're typically obtained through mining. And some of that mining is in some of the most difficult jurisdictions in the world. And so the opportunity for workers to be exploited for child labor and so on is huge. And the consumer doesn't want to think about that being an ingredient in their new mobile phone. And so we do see that becoming a flashpoint regularly. And therefore, the brands at the top of the supply chain, the hiring client as we see them, they're very keen to make sure that they've got transparency through the supply chain and they understand where that risk might exist and how to manage it. So, aside from modern slavery, forced labor, child labor and so on, which are all heartbreaking, there's also places where subcontractors have unfair economic advantage in the relationship. And so they exploit workers with various forms of inequality and certainly unfair pay. And of course, another area that's really significant, again, when we talk about some of those primary industries, is the potential environmental impact, which is a major issue to many consumers in developing countries. But the reality is, again, if you want to take minerals out of the ground, there's an environmental consequence to that. So making sure it's properly licensed, properly managed, that there's a plan to repair the environment after the activity, that there's a plan for the community when the mine's finished, are all really important. And that's before you even get to indigenous rights, which are often a factor in many of the industries we work in. Often the minerals that you want to obtain or the oil and gas that you need to get at is on somebody else's land from a historical and cultural perspective. And that land is sacred to them in many ways. And so you have to approach this with sensitivity. And it takes time to do it properly. And if you don't do it properly, you don't just get a reaction from the tribe, from the indigenous people. You'll get a reaction from wider society, potentially all over the world. So there are lots of flashpoints that are created by this situation. Our job really is to get in there and understand the risk, make the hiring client aware of where those risks exist, and then support them as they put in mitigations to behave in an ethical and environmentally sensitive way, in a way that protects the broader group of stakeholders, that protects the environment, and also, from a commercial point of view, protects their brand.
Thank you. That's a fascinating insight to the industry here. I was just thinking that supply chain was about getting something from point A to point B. I mean, there's 100 considerations around it. But it feels to me as if, again, this is a wonderful learning point for a lot of the clients that we hope will be listening to this podcast, because in the midst of this big shift taking place in society where there's, and I love your point about the fact that it's the transparency of communication and data and everything else that's just almost like the spotlights have been switched on everywhere. There's no dark corners anymore and people are watching. That what companies need to do is recognize they absolutely need to be working in a network of relationships with people who are capable of dealing with the complexities of these issues. No single company surely could do all of this thinking and both risk mitigation and opportunity seeking on their own. And therefore it's probably companies like Achilles that find a nice space in the middle to help all of these companies do these things. So with every challenge, with every threat, there's also that opportunity, isn't there?
Absolutely. We work with some of the world's largest organizations to help them manage the complexity that they face. There was a time where if you were involved in procurement, it was specifying the product, getting the right price, getting the right delivery date, and that's where it stopped. that doesn't cut it anymore for a variety of reasons, good reasons. And I think nation-state governments, wider society, the media, consumers at the end of the value chain are all interested in the provenance of the products and services that they consume. And they don't want to feel bad about their consumption. They want to feel that in some way, by being part of that value chain, they've made a positive contribution over and above the simple economics of the relationship. And so as society has chosen to regulate and legislate around these areas, some of the larger organizations have found it's very challenging actually to get ahead of that, and certainly not a challenge they can deal with individually. And so one of the models that Achilles has promoted over the years is to create communities within an industry where we define common qualification standards to participate and syndicate that standard across a wide group of suppliers for a group of buyers, so that we raise the standard at an industry level and everybody operates more efficiently and everybody operates more ethically at the same time.
Paul, if I can jump in, you talked about modern day slavery, and I think what you were saying about it, it's fascinating. The one thing we do with the Great Elephant Radar is we're very interested in identifying kind of weak signals, things that perhaps are just coming over the horizon that may have a really high impact, or increasingly become more probable, but people are either missing them or they're ignoring them because they kind of hope they go away or someone else will deal with it. Yeah, modern day slavery, I mean, yeah, I've been reading a few articles about it. I think there's more and more about this in the news. And so it's definitely starting to ping louder and louder on our radar. But it wasn't that long ago that I thought, naively, clearly, that slavery was, a thing of the past, something that, happened in America back in 1700s and so on. What are you seeing? Is this a trend that's on the up with more immigration and the ability to, do some really terrible things?
Poverty and population displacement for other geopolitical or environmental events creates disenfranchised and people who do not have power and do not have voice. It's an extraordinary thing to consider that modern slavery exists in plain sight. I recently spent some time with the Modern Slavery Commissioner in New South Wales in Australia, whose own calculation is that 2 in 1,000 workers in New South Wales are being held in conditions of modern slavery. Now, this is one of the most developed economies in the world, a highly civilized, highly sophisticated, wealthy nation where when you look around, everything seems to be wonderful. But look at the subcontracted cleaner in the office block or the security guard on the building site. Are we sure that those people are in normally employed situations where they got the freedom to come and go, where they're getting the full benefit of the work that they do? Or are they being held in unacceptable conditions with no right to leave? Their passport's been confiscated. They've been effectively brought into debt servitude. They've been promised a better life and they had to pay for it, but then with a usurious interest rate applied so they can never pay off the debt and they're trapped forever. And that's before you get to human trafficking, and, people who've been, tricked, cajoled, financially pushed into sex work in foreign countries. So it's a tragic picture around the world, and it exists not just in the jurisdictions where you might, in a prejudicial way, expect it to. It exists in modern cities right in front of our very eyes.
I can give a shout out here to, Dean, just give a shout out to a mate of mine with the fantastic name of Fuzz Kitto, literally his name. But he might be part of the team you met with in Australia. He's the co-director of Be Slavery Free based in Australia and probably had input to the work that you do. Yeah, this is something we do need to keep our eyes on. It doesn't feel like a 21st century issue, but it absolutely is.
Yeah, let me dig a little bit deeper here, because one of the things about the Grey Elephant Radar is that it's there to really help businesses identify not only the risks, but also the opportunities. Because we're big believers that the best way to predict the future is actually to go out there and create it. And if you understand the impacts of these grey elephants, you're in a better position to understand how the trends are influencing and changing the world, and what you can do about it yourself to make the world a better place. So what can companies do to mitigate and eradicate modern day slavery as an example?
So you start at a policy level within your own organization. A lot of companies will produce a statement on modern slavery. Companies over a certain size are required to. That statement alone does nothing. It is kind of a box ticking exercise. What you then have to do is back that statement with procedures to support the policy. And those procedures require you to go do the investigation. And that can be, in the first instance, for a company like Achilles to interview the suppliers and then their subcontractors to understand how they operate. If there are indicators of higher risk, then we can go physically audit locations and actually ask those workers what's happening. Do you have your passport? Did you have to buy your own PPE? Where do you live? Do you live with other workers? Are you forced to live with those other workers? How much of your salary do you actually receive? So we will go ask those questions in the field and prove out whether this is happening or not. And it can be a shock to the hiring client because they think they've contracted with a perfectly respectable subcontractor to provide a basic facilities management service. But when it goes to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, it's harder to know what happens. We see it in garment manufacturing. We see it in food production as well, where people are subcontracting to subcontractors, and suddenly you've lost control over the ethics of what's actually happening in the factory.
It must be a nightmare, for clients to try and manage this. It's great to know that a company like Achilles is out there, acting as a force for good to stamp out these kind of treatments and behaviors. Fantastic.
I suppose that leads into a conversation more generally, Paul, around ESG type of issues, which isn't just about climate change and the environment. It's about all sorts of governance and being a force for good. Do you see that companies are moving beyond just the basics of sort of just a compliance type mindset? And are they seeing ESG issues as a strategic opportunity, as a way maybe of getting competitive advantage without just being capitalistic about the thinking, but to sort of go beyond the minimum and beyond just compliance?
Yeah, I think an interesting change has happened over the last 30 years or so while I've been in business. When I first started working, the dominant logic was of shareholder primacy, the economic philosophy of Milton Friedman, that the company's primary responsibility was to the shareholders, and the shareholders would decide whether they did good or not with the proceeds. The world's changed. The world's changed for the better, in my view. And I think what we have now are a generation of managers, business leaders, organizational leaders who have a sense of wider stakeholder responsibility. And whilst legislation and regulation forces them in a certain direction, actually, I often feel like we're pushing on an open door in most places where we go in and have these discussions. People want to do the right thing for ethical reasons, for environmental reasons, for moral reasons, but they can also see the business case. And if you think about this rationally, whether you're a climate change denier or not, if you cut your carbon footprint, you'll cut your costs. So I can still sell you a carbon audit and carbon reduce program because it still makes sense for you. The saving is huge compared to what you spend. If you have a supply chain that depends on child labor, modern slavery, unfair labor practices, you have a vulnerable supply chain. At some point, it's going to be disrupted. If you choose to do business with rogue nations, if you choose to do business with people who are funded by organizations or individuals on sanctions or watch lists, you have a vulnerable supply chain, and you're creating legal risk for your own business and brand and reputational risk for your own business. So what I find with the most mature businesses and the largest and most complex businesses that we deal with is that they appreciate that good governance is good business. It's good business because it cuts your costs. It's good business because it improves your resilience. It means that you retain faith with the wider stakeholder community, makes your debt cheaper, makes investors more likely to work with you. So actually, the idea that ESG should be weaponized as some modern woke concept, to me, is ridiculous. ESG is good business. It saves you money, it makes you more resilient, it makes you more attractive to customers, to employees, to the wider stakeholder communities, and it protects your brand value.
Fascinating, Paul. So let's look ahead. That's one great thing about the grey elephant model is it's a lens kind of into the future. I often like to think of these grey elephants as almost the outcome, the result of forces of progress. You think about, we've been doing a lot of work with clients around plastic, eradication of plastic. And plastic is, in many ways, is a wonder material. It helps us to keep food for longer. It sanitizes things. It's great packaging, but it has a really negative side effect as well. That progress leads to pollution on incredible levels. So many of these, what we're seeing as these grey elephants are coming together and colliding, is they're the result of progress in society. And we see these moments in history, about every 100, 150 years, these forces of progress, they come together, they collide, and all of a sudden you have sharp transformation and the world changes dramatically. So I'm really keen to see, get some insight from you, from what you're seeing out in the field. And so looking ahead, what do you think will separate the winners from the laggards in supply chain resilience? If thinking over the next 5 years, what are your future predictions? Yeah.
So first of all, the organizations that embrace the challenge will be the winners. Those that resist the challenge will find that an irresistible force in due course, either because they'll be hopelessly disrupted and they'll be unprepared for the resilience challenges that they face, or the market will turn against them because of their practices. Plastic is a really interesting example. As organizations become more responsible, they start to take a view on what happens to their product downstream. And we found, working with some of the largest companies in the world, it's not just the supply chain that they're interested in. It's what happens after they sell the product that they're interested in. And so plastic is one of those really good examples. How do I get the plastic back? How do I reuse the plastic? How do I make sure it doesn't end up in a river or an ocean? Is an interesting discussion. But it's also an opportunity for entrepreneurial chemists. How do I produce a plastic that'll just break down and turn into something actually quite harmless? And we're seeing that kind of thing happen already. But ultimately, I think the winners here are those that understand that just box ticking, just measuring, just being compliant is not enough. What you need to do is build agility and resilience so that you can move with the events. And if you can predict some of these grey elephants, fantastic, because you can then workshop and simulate the impact of them and test your organization. Some kind of wargaming mentality around it. We do that in our own organization, and it's very effective. So I think the future success of organizations is going to be getting that predictive analytical insight rather than looking through a rearview mirror and just saying, oh yeah, I've been good, I've recorded everything, here's my report. What you want is something actionable within your own organization and a team of people in your organization that understand it and can work with it and can move quickly as they're hit by these absolutely inevitable global factors.
Yeah, we always say at TomorrowToday Consulting that if you wait for grey elephants to appear, it's too late to prepare. Well, Paul, this has been an amazing conversation, and we really want to thank you for joining us today. Great insights, and I think we could probably carry on for the entire afternoon just talking to you about this kind of stuff. It's really, really fascinating. Graeme, final thoughts before we close off here?
Well, if I can ask a cheeky question, Paul, if you had advice to a CEO, maybe not necessarily just in the supply chain or logistics environment, but pass your wisdom on as a CEO of some years and some experience, what do you think CEOs in particular should be thinking about right now?
I think you've got to be ready to invest in intelligent supply chain technology. There's a massive emerging technology that can help you get the insight, the transparency, and the resilience that you need. AI, blockchain, Internet of Things, anything that drives real-time decision-making that allows you to get ahead of the events that are going to infect you. I think you've got to embed ESG into your core strategy. If you don't like the term ESG, it doesn't matter. Unpack it. Talk about good governance and sustainability. But I think that has to be part of the strategy to ensure that you have broad stakeholder trust. And I do think testing is important. Go out and a war game, do some scenario planning, try to imagine what the world's going to be like as that big grey elephant emerges and hits you. I think if you can get ahead of the game like that, then you'll never call it exactly, but at least you'll have put yourself and the organization in a mindset to respond in an agile and resilient manner.
Thanks, Paul. Great advice. And thank you as well for your partnership, especially with this Elephants in the Boardroom podcast. Hopefully people understand now why we were very happy with the partnership and the type of insights we share from Tomorrow Today through to Achilles. So thank you again.
It's been fantastic for us as well. Thank you. Really enjoyed talking to you both. Appreciate the ongoing partnership.
What a fascinating conversation. Dean, thanks for setting that up. I know you've worked with Paul for some while and know Achilles well, but that was really insightful for me to get behind the scenes of obviously a company that we don't really see front and center, right? They do a lot of work behind the scenes to make sure that those supply chains around the world are working. What stood out for you? I know you know Achilles quite well, but what stood out for you in the conversation?
I think there were two things that really stood out for me. First is the increasing importance of ESG, sustainable business. And I know there's a lot of bashing of leadership thinking around ESG, especially the anti-woke movement. And, I think there's a real sense that, ESG policies are admin and a burden. But the reality is actually is good business practice. If you want a business that is sustainable, isn't harming the environment, that is good for the people you employ and the customers, then you should be giving a lot of thinking to your ESG strategy. And maybe, you don't have to, like Paul said, you don't have to call it ESG. Yeah, it's about sustainable business practice. So think about that. The other thing that stood out for me is just the modern day slavery. It's frightening. I think it's a grey elephant that we don't talk about, that I wasn't even aware until fairly recently just how endemic and what a huge issue modern day slavery is. And so that for me was quite an eye-opener.
I mentioned my mate Faz Kito while we were chatting to Paul, and I've just looked up. He's involved with beslaveryfree.com, beslaveryfree.com. So I highly recommend. We'll put that in the show notes. Go and have a look if you want to find out more about what they do. He's also involved, by the way, in creating the chocolate scorecard, which I think is chocolatescorecard.com, which is all the chocolate companies get rated. And that's the point, right? Is that some industries have the consumer spotlight on them, like chocolate does for their ethical supply chains. But actually it affects every industry, and probably means affects every single company, every single leader who might listen to this podcast. You could do something about thinking about how do we raise the game in terms of just being a business for good. We absolutely believe that business for good to do is good for business. It's a cliche, we know, but we're convinced that that's true. That I agree with you, Dean. That stood out for me. I suppose I'd add just a third thing, which is just the incredible complexity with running any business these days, and the type of human you need to be in order to be a CEO. And I'm sure that Paul's got his finger on the pulse of the business and the details. But for me, what was very impressive was that strategic, high-level view. He obviously trusts his team to get the details done, and then he gets involved where those strategic issues really, really count. And I suppose that's why the grey elephant radar has connected with Paul and with the Achilles team, is because they realize, Yeah. You've got to do what you've got to do to run your business, of course. But actually, it's that view of what is coming next. What are the things you're not thinking about that actually has to get a lot of CEO attention? And I was fascinated that Paul was just able to dig into topic after topic in that strategic space. Really impressive.
No, it's an impressive CEO, and it's an impressive business. Yeah, I think for me, the key thing for leaders to think about as you look to explore the impact of these elephants in the boardroom and these grey elephants is to recognize that they are converging, they are colliding with one another, and on their own, they are, climate change, aging, the big squeezes, multipolarity. On their own, these grey elephants are huge forces of change, but colliding together at the same time, this is a once in a century kind of perfect storm that the world is going through. And that's why, going back to your point right at the start of this podcast, Graeme, is that it's feeling really crazy, complex, difficult out there. And it's because we're seeing all of these grey elephants colliding, they're stampeding with one another. They're creating a new world, a world that we've never experienced, never been before. We're seeing, our grey elephant, the intelligent advancements. We're seeing technology being able to do things, like you were saying about 23andMe. Ability to sequence our DNA overnight is a world that we've never lived through before. There are things here that we don't know the implications about, and we need to think deeply about this new world that we're entering. This is a sharp transformation. This is a new world. You see these moments every 100, 150 years in world history. You can go back and you can see these moments. Within a decade or two, the world suddenly changed. And that's what we're living through. The grey elephants can help make sense of all of this chaos and this change that's happening around us. It's more than just change. There's something very special about what's happening at the moment. It may not feel special, but we are living during a pivotal moment in world history. And that's, gives great opportunities for those leaders who really have their finger on the pulse of change. So it's exciting time. It's scary, but I think it's exciting. It's more exciting than scary.
I agree with you, Dean. We could keep talking about this for ages. We've probably used up all the time that somebody could give us for this episode. Thank you for listening in. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Where did we go today? A global genetics database, water running out in the Himalayas, modern day slavery, data-driven supply chain management. An incredible whip around the world. Dean, I always enjoy these conversations. Thanks again.
No, thank you, Graeme. It was great chatting to you. I really look forward to each of these sessions. For our regular listeners, we are doing these every month. Please comment, please like, send us your questions. If there's anything that you see, any grey elephants that are popping up on your own radar, what would you like us to talk about if there's anything in particular? So send us your questions, queries. We would love to hear what you're thinking and what you are seeing. Well, Graeme, been great having this conversation with you, and I look forward to the next podcast in a month's time.